In this video, I'm going to go over Carl Jung's ideas surrounding the extroverted irrational types. So the extroverted irrational types obviously is extroverted, so they are more influenced by the external world, and they have a tie or they have adapted to the object or the objective world that we perceive as the objective world. And so that's the first part. They're extroverted. Okay, so they are the irrational types. So Jung conceptualized the irrational functions as sensation or intuition. And so the extroverted irrational type would be those who have extroverted sensation or extroverted intuition. And so these are both modes of receiving information, okay, from the external world. You're being irrational. You believe in magic. As opposed to the rational types, which are who use thinking or feeling. And so they're rational because they can discriminate between perceptions and make judgments and form judgments. Whereas the sensation and intuition, you're not forming a judgment, you just have pure perceptions. Imagine not knowing how you feel or think, but all you know is what you see and perceive. So you're just perceiving the information, whether it's through your 5 physical senses, through extroverted sensing, or whether it's via intuition, extroverted intuition, the intuitive nature of the objective world, or the things that you perceive throughout the world, okay? And so these types are, Jung says that they are, defined by pure perception. So they don't have much judgment to actually judge what they're perceiving, the information that they're receiving from the world. And so he says here that objective events both conform to law and are accidental. Insofar as they conform to law, they are accessible to reason. Insofar as they are accidental, they are not. And so Jung basically goes on to show that the rational types will really be kind of in tune with the way that nature or the objective world conforms to law. And so they will use that with their reasoning and form judgments based on that. But the extroverted irrational type doesn't do that. They actually sometimes, according to Jung, now you got to remember in Jung's typology, when he's talking in psychological types, he's talking about someone who was very dominated by their dominant function, and all their other 3 functions that come after are largely unconscious. And so they haven't really differentiated any of the other functions at all. So he's talking in extremes. These are extreme cases of people who are completely dominated by their dominant function. In this case, they're dominated by a perception dominant function, which would be extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition. And so he says basically that these people are, they are like empiricists. They are the extreme version of empiricists. They are only really conscious of everything they experience. And so they're not cottoning onto the idea of, there's laws throughout nature. And so they actually may assign a coincidence to something deliberate. They might think, because everything that's not a law of nature is just a coincidence, right? But they might actually start to ascribe to those coincidences and things that happen to them through their experience something that is actually deliberate, and so because they are basically trapped in their world of experience. So I know I'm an extroverted intuitive, that I need to experience a lot of things to know what it is. Otherwise, I can't really make a judgment on it. It's really hard to make a judgment on it. I have to just keep experiencing different things to know how I feel or think about something. And so that's what this type is kind of like. And also, Jung begins to talk about the relationship between, say, an irrational type and a rational type. The irrational type will presuppose, according to Jung, that the other person is just like them, in a sense. But that individual in front of them is just like them. But the other person will perceive that, no, there is a large group of people. It is common to be like this. And this is kind of what commonly happens. And we are all just sharing in, like a common viewpoint. But the irrational extrovert is kind of, in this sense, Jung is saying in Psychological Types, that he's kind of blind to the fact that this is a common viewpoint that people have. He might have ideas about how something should be, and that's actually quite common, but he thinks or she thinks that they're the only one who has that, and that person right there in front of them also just seems to share in that as well. You see, so there's kind of an egoism in it. Like they see the world through their own kind of eyes, not kind of objectively through, rationally through the fact that that's a common experience. So I think Jung is outlining these things, and again, these are kind of extremes. Like when you read your own type, you notice how extreme it really is, because personally, I'm an extroverted intuitive, and I don't really think. Normally, I think I do think about common viewpoints of things, but I don't know. Maybe I'm more unconscious than I think I am. It's hard to tell sometimes. Jung, am I really that irrational? What? Tell me I can differentiate. Tell me I can differentiate my functions, Jung. Yeah, he's basically saying, here, I'll read this quote to make it a little bit clearer. It frequently happens that despite an absolute difference of standpoint in a rapport, nevertheless comes about, and in the following way. One party, which is, I believe he's referring to the irrational type, one party, by unspoken projection, assumes that the other is, in all essentials, of the same opinion as himself, while the other, which I think he's referring to as the rational type, divines or senses an objective community of interest, of which, however, the former, so the irrational type, has no conscious inkling, and whose existence he would at once dispute, just as it would never occur to the other that his relationship should be based on a common point of view. So I don't think the extroverted the extroverted irrational type realizes or can kind of differentiate between themselves and the overall perspectives out there. They are kind of blind to how other people think, in a sense, and they just assume that the other person thinks just like them. And so it's a kind of a strange critique here, and I can kind of understand where Jung's talking about, especially if he's talking about an extraverted sensor. But this is meant to be all extroverted irrational types, which would include extroverted intuitives as well. He also says that this type can be they do have rational judgments, but they're largely unconscious. So it can seem to the rational type that they are actually plotting and scheming and making kind of these harsh judgments, but it's actually their unconscious that is making these judgments on behalf of these extroverted irrational types. So their rationality is unconscious, but it still nonetheless manifests in their life and in what they're doing. And so it can come off as, at times, quite naive, or they can also be quite ruthless and violent. I mean, that would make sense because in Myers-Briggs, the extroverted irrational type would be ENFP, ENTP, ESFP, and ESTP. Now, Myers-Briggs differs a lot or a little bit from Jung's original typology, and we'll get to that in other videos. But it's good to just know your kind of type, to know the type that sits within this category of extroverted irrational types. And so I guess you can really picture an ESTP being quite ruthless and violent. But, and a lot of ENFPs, I know myself, are quite naive at times as well. So I think we do fit this picture. But I think the thing to gain from all this is the difference between the perception dominant and the rational or judging dominant functions. And so, I often perceive a lot of information far more than I can keep up with in my judgments. What do you mean you can't make a decision? Make a decision, man! Make a decision! Yeah, and that's what Jung talks about here too. They base themselves exclusively on experience, so exclusively that as a rule, their judgment cannot keep pace with their experience. So that's definitely what I think categorizes this type within Jung's typology. So I hope I've given some justice to the extroverted irrational types. And if you like this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.